Hello, everybody. I'm Derek Arden, and welcome to Monday Night Live. I've got an exciting Monday Night Live tonight because I've got Mike Foley on. Mike is the head of the Wessex Academy Trust, where he leads 12 schools with 7,000 students and he tells me, much more than 700 staff. I don't really understand how you could possibly do that, which is why I've invited Mike to explain that to us. But beforehand, Mike, would you just give us a snapshot of your career?
Yeah, and thank you for having me on, Derek. My background is South London. Hence, I think we were talking about football and my Crystal Palace connection. So I was brought up about 3 miles from the Crystal Palace ground in West Croydon. Some of you may know that West Croydon is a very different place to Dorset. And then I suppose the first turning point for me in a way, Derek, was 11. I passed the 11 plus, and then I was invited following that to sit an entrance exam and an interview to go to in a sense, a very privileged school. Went there, very different to anything I'd ever seen before. Got my love of rugby there, but very different to where I've been brought up. Then on to university, did a history degree, and actually never really thought that much about teaching. Of course, it came up, but I know some people who later go on into teaching say they wanted to do it from the time they were 4 or 5. That certainly wasn't me. But at the end of doing my degree, there was the chance to do a postgrad, and somebody said, no matter what you do later in life, the ability to teach will hold you in good stead. So I took the opportunity, and almost from the first day I did it, I loved it. And any thoughts I had initially, I was going to go on and do law and do a conversion degree. I was going to do a year doing my postgrad and then doing that, save up some money because it costs some money to do a conversion degree then. And I decided I would stay with it. And I moved from London. I started teaching in London, then went up to Suffolk and got moved around in Suffolk. The local authority were amazing with me. I went up the career ladder very quickly, became a head when I was still in my late 30s, which at that time was incredibly young to go to a fairly large secondary school. And then I stayed 10 years there, did my first headship, and I had a decision to make. Did I stay or should I take up another challenge? And I decided I would. And at that challenge was at the Thomas Hardy School in Dorset, just down the road from where I'm sitting now. One of the largest schools in the country, over 2,000 students. And then I was there for about 5 years, and these new multi-academy trusts were coming in where not only did you have the opportunity to run one school, but to run several. And we took that opportunity at Thomas Hardy. And for a while I did both. I was CEO of the new trust, which had 4 schools in it, and I was still head of Thomas Hardy. And then in 2021, it just took off. We knew that there were a lot more schools coming in. It was going to grow, and I couldn't do 2 jobs. So I gave up the headship of Thomas Hardy to become, if you like, the full-time CEO. And that's what I've been doing for the last 4 years.
Well, that seems to me an absolutely amazing job, an amazing leadership job, and everyone on this is a leader of some sort.
Yeah.
I really want to know how you do it, Mike, and that's the worst question to ask anyone. How
Yeah.
do you manage
Yeah.
1,000 students, 700
Yeah.
teachers and academics,
Yeah.
and still keep your sanity?
Yeah. I mean, it's a big challenge. I mean, obviously, Thomas Hardy was already a very big school with a very big staff and so on. So I'd had that experience, 2 headships, which I think has held me in good stead. But I suppose, Derek, that what the challenge for me has been in the last 4 years, I'm sitting here in our central office in Poundbury. And of course, these other 12 schools are scattered around. One of them is, for example, is a 40-minute drive from here. So the big challenge for me, I think as a leader, maybe my success in the past came from maybe my ability to work with people, to encourage them, motivate them on a day-by-day basis. The big challenge for me is sitting here, and how do I manage to do that across 12 sites? I suppose the answer is I think of it as, I suppose, cogs really, that we've got this central cog here in Poundbury. And really it's through those heads. Those 12 heads are, if you say to me, how do you do it? In a way, it is through them. How do I develop culture? How do I make sure that we've got, a similar destination, similar journey? And then on top of that, probably those people on the line maybe who aren't familiar with Muti Academy Trust, it's not just the teaching and learning. We do the whole thing. Every school's IT operation, their HR, their finance. And so, of course, a lot of that then runs from here. We've got a finance team downstairs, an IT team, an HR team, and all the rest of it. So on an operational level, that's how we do it. But in terms of delivering, in terms of education, standards of education, it's through those heads. And funnily enough, they were in today, and we were doing a session with them. And, again, it's that notion, that concept of cogs, of, driving the organization, and they go back and they drive their middle leaders and their senior leaders and so on, so that we get that message and that, that's, as I say, that similar journey, really.
So, Mike, what are the biggest challenges in education in 2025?
It's funny, really, the trustees, I'm sure Godfrey will be laughing at this point. I asked the heads quite recently of all the schools that if I had magic dust, what could I do if I gave them 3 things that they could do? And one thing, well, the first thing was money, that there is a real issue over funding and finance. I think I said to you, Derek, I listened to one of your other guests talk about funding gaps in HE, and it's very similar in schools. And of course, we have a £50 million budget that we have to stick to every year. We're both a company and a charity, but there is no black hole of money. We have to make sure that those 12 schools work within that budget. So that's one thing. The second thing is recruitment and retention. We cannot get teachers for love nor money. And as a country, I notice we've got some international guests on the line. We've missed our targets for recruiting teachers, I think, every year for the past 10 years. And we've got an aging workforce, so that would definitely be there. And I think the third thing is, and maybe particularly post-COVID, Derek, is that increasingly challenging students coming through the system. And, I suppose it links into resources, but meeting those more complex challenges, particularly post-COVID. So I think that those are the 3 key challenges.
How do you keep up to date with what's going on, and how do you keep the heads and your senior teachers up to date?
Yeah, so we've got a big training operation here. I said we've got a finance team. We've also got a school improvement team. So we run a full program of training here, for example, CPD. We also run a teacher training operation. So if you came to this office on a Friday, we would have 15 of our own students, people who've gone through uni, done a degree, but are doing the equivalent of a postgrad in teaching. So, and they're key, actually, Derek, in terms of driving that teacher training operation. They're fairly key. You say about keeping up to date, that's one of the ways. And me personally, Derek, I'm also an hostel inspector. And so I do about 1 inspection a month, and the training that Ofsted give me is second to none in terms of keeping up to date, keeping me sharp, alongside what I do generally in terms of reading. I'm a real keen reader and observer of particularly things like leadership and leadership styles, leadership strategies. So those are the main ways, really. But it's a really important part of what I do, is that I am absolutely up to date in terms of what's going on and what's happening in the education world, and more broadly in terms of leadership. One of the reasons I'm very interested in this podcast and your guests and so on, to listen in, to know what's going on outside of education. I'm a real keen observer, not just of what's going on in education, but what's going on outside of education in terms of leadership.
Now, Mike, you mentioned Ofsted, which is quite interesting. Ofsted gets a bad name, doesn't it, with the Ruth Perry issue
Yeah,
where
yeah,
he took her life over an
yeah,
Ofsted inspection.
yeah,
I think there's some good parts of Ofsted, and is it
yeah.
one of your roles to educate the head teachers when you go around, or is it just to tell them what they're doing wrong?
Yeah, I mean, Austed, the line we pedal out all the time is we have no, preferred method. So our job isn't to go in, Derek, and to tell people, what to do. I suppose our key job is to confirm the school's own observations. What does it do well? What does it do less well? What does it need to do to improve? And that's really the spine that runs through. If you ever pick up an Austed report, that's the spine that runs through it. And I suppose that is our job, to assist schools, as well as giving parents, of course, and the community information. These schools are all, tax funded, so there's an obligation there. It's taxpayers' money that's being spent on education to report back and for them to be accountable. And I think all school leaders accept that. But as you rightly say, it's had a bad press, but it's gone through a lot of change, and probably, as you notice in today's paper, is due to go through more change again, ready for next September. But it's got a big responsibility.
Doing your job, Mike, what's the most difficult thing you have to do?
I think probably I kind of alluded to it before, Derek. It's the fact that where we sit, I suppose the challenge for me is, how do I influence now an organization at this scale, working at scale? It's different even in a big school. So that's definitely a challenge for me. And I've had to change my own leadership, I suppose, to take account of that. But I suppose, like most people on the line who've had a leadership post, Derek, it's the people bit. Sometimes people say, what's the key thing? I often get asked by, we run a course here for future leaders, people who are thinking of going on to be headship, and they always say to me, what's the main thing? What's the trick to being, a good leader? And I always answer, it's not a flippant comment really. I say that the answer is to get people to do stuff, the complexity. And what I've found, the higher I've gone up in this profession, Derek, and again, maybe people online will, maybe it will resonate with them, is I've become de-skilled. That, the days I used to do the school timetable, I used to do the data, even, in terms of doing, the school calendar, the assessment program. If somebody now said to me next week, oh, so-and-so is not very well in one of our schools, they've left the timetable half finished, can you go on and do it? I probably could do it, but it would take me ages to get myself, back up to speed on it, to do that stuff that I did as a deputy head and assistant head. And now the trick is that, how do I get other people to do that stuff for me? And how do I motivate them? How do I pull them rather than push them? How do I convince them this is the right way to go? So my job has become more and more de-skilled and more about my work through people. And when I was at Thomas Hardy, Derek, we used to do a briefing on a Monday morning, and Thomas Hardy, obviously 2,000 pupils, and we obviously had 300 staff there. And I'd stand up and do a briefing, and it used to cross my mind when I was giving out, guidelines for the week and what needed doing, that if somebody said to me, I'm not going to do that, what would I do? And also the fact, looking around the room, well, I can't teach physics. I can't, now do that. I'm relying on those people to do what I want them to do. And therein lies the complexity of leadership. How do I get people to do what I want them to do stuff? And how do I bring them with me? And I'd say that's probably remains both the biggest challenge, but also the most enjoyable bit, the complexity of, I can continually thinking, how do I do that better? How do I get them to do stuff for me? And, to stay with the message.
And Mike, how do you get inspected by Ofsted?
That's a very, very interesting question, Derek, because there is talk at the moment that there needs to be a change in legislation for that to happen. But I'm sure that is the direction of travel, that there'll come a time not too far into the future where it will be trusts and people like me who will be inspected. and they will come in and inspect Wessex, and they'll say to me, right, well, give me 2 or 3 of your schools where you can go and visit, but ostensibly we're looking at you and whether, and I would support that, Derek. I think that's quite right. At the moment, there is still accountability. I'm accountable to the trust. There's a board of trustees, and above that, there's a group of people called members. So it follows a kind of a company structure, really. And I report to them. I report to the trustees, every half term. And they hold me to account, and they really do hold me to account, not just on educational standards, but on budgetary matters, for example, number of recruitments we're making, whether we think our workforce is motivated, and a whole load of other measures they ask me to report on. So that's the bread and butter that we're held accountable, and quite rightly so. But I'm sure that the next stage will be that Ofsted will come in as well as that. And of course, we get audited, Derek, like other companies every year. We have an annual general meeting where, not just the trustees or the directors, we've both got trustees and directors because we're both a company and a charity. So it's interchangeable, same people, but, depending on what you call them, we have an annual general meeting, we have a company report. So we're subject to the same, I suppose, regulation and accountability that other companies have. But on top of that, there is regular accountability about what we're doing.
Wow. Now, 50 million budget. £50 million budget doesn't actually sound very much to me for that number of schools and that number of people.
It's interesting. Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, actually, Derek. I think in a sense, Derek, our main, so 80% of our budget is staffing. Obviously the sense the Muti Academy Trust, it's interesting, really. The way it works, Derek, is that the Secretary of State, under the new academisation, ostensibly the Education Secretary issues a funding agreement and says, right, I've got 50 million quid. I want 7,000 young people in that sort of area of Dorset to be educated. I'll put in 12 sites, 12 buildings. But then after that, how you do it and, who you employ and all is up to you. I'm going to hold you to account because I've just paid you 50 million and I've got every right to pull the funding agreement if Ofsted come in and say that standards of education are poor, or you blow the budget, or whatever it happens to be. But that's the way that Muti Academy Trusts work, and we're held accountable for it. But that 50 million in the main, Derek, covers staff salaries. If a roof blows off, it comes out of that money. If the heating system goes down, if we need to install, as we are at the moment, new IT, whatever it happens to be. We had a really bad cyber attack in one of our schools last year, and had to pay a very large amount of money for someone to come in and to put new security measures in place. But all of those things has to come out of that 50 million.
Wow. That's and tell me, no politics on this show, but the government's just changed here, and has that affected you in any way?
It hasn't at the moment, Derek, and immediately I can say there's nothing, some changes to Ofsted and so on, but we're at the point where there's a big review of the curriculum going on at the moment. That's due to publish their interim report quite shortly. There's an Ofsted review, as we've alluded to, going on. So inspection will change for September 2025. And of course, we're waiting for the public spending review that was due to be published in the spring, and the Chancellor now says it will be later in the summer, which will tell us what our spending is likely to be in the next 3 years. So we're on the cusp, Derek, although nothing immediately. There's lots of things on the horizon where I think we'll see some pretty big changes going into 2025, 2026, and we'll wait to hear the detail on that.
Mike, there's a few questions in the chat box, and I'm going to throw a few of those at you now. I'll read them out. Given your comment about culture across the piece and shared support services, is there still scope for each of the 12 schools to have their own identity and flavour?
That's a fascinating question, Derek. The answer to that is yes, that And I'm very aware that Godfrey's on the line as one of our members, actually. And it's a very interesting thing about this thing. We've got the 12 schools, and what we've said all along, Derek, is that if you want to just row your own boat, don't join a trust. If you just want to go off and do your own thing, and you've got a very distinct, unique culture, then a multi-academy trust, I kind of think of a multi-academy trust as a flotilla of boats. And if you're somebody who doesn't buy into that, doesn't understand maybe, or doesn't accept that, improvements in standards and even economies of scale, don't happen best, which I do as a group, then we would always say to people, because it's voluntary, unless you are a school that gets itself into trouble, in which case the government will force you to join a trust. But assuming that doesn't happen, you have the choice. So if you're somebody who doesn't want to be part of a collective, doesn't buy into the idea that the best way to raise educational standards is through collaboration, then you wouldn't join. So, we're certainly not a multi-academy trust who would say, just come in and carry on doing your own thing, because I don't see the point. And, almost you're losing the benefits. Equally, Derek, I'm a firm believer that just cloning 12 schools, putting everybody in the same uniform, exactly the same curriculum, teach exactly the same way. And there are some trusts who think that is the answer. We don't. We think the answer is somewhere in the middle, whereby, yes, we do have, a common vision. We do have a common culture, but it doesn't mean to say Monday morning, every 7-year-old across the trust is learning this in this way. We don't believe that, because I'm a great believer in innovation, and that's the way we move things on, and how we continue to develop. Thomas Hardy was an outstanding school when I took it over. One of the questions at interview was, how do you make an outstanding school better?
Oh, wow.
And one of the things that we did at Thomas Hardy was to continually, I told the staff that their job was to innovate and experiment. And the only condition was that they came back and told us when things failed, and explained and analysed and evaluated why. Now, I wouldn't advise that. If you come and you take over a school that's in serious trouble, telling them to innovate and experiment isn't the right thing to do. And that may be a school where you need far tighter guidelines, and this is how we do it, and this is how we arrange classrooms and all the rest of it. But ostensibly, I'm a believer in earned autonomy, that the way to keep moving things forward is for people to innovate, but as I say, within a common structure, framework, common policies, common culture, but giving people still the chance to make local decisions about what should be going on in, for example, in classrooms. But it's a great question.
Okay, there's a few in there, but I think you've answered one or two of them. But let's turn to artificial intelligence and ask you the question, how do you use it in education, and how do you avoid plagiarism?
Yeah, that's a fascinating one as well, isn't it? So current, really. And AI is very much, I'm sure it is for everybody at the moment, in terms of, the live issue. And very interesting to hear one of your speakers say that ChatGPT is old hat, Derek, at one stage, and I get that. So that's a very live thing for us at the moment, both in how we run the organization. What can we do to make ourselves more efficient? And can we reduce costs using AI? I'm sure all companies are looking at that, and we definitely are. And then in school, Derek, what we've tried to do is to, we can't be Canute. AI is here, and to simply say it's banned and all the rest of it. So we've tried at the moment to, I mean, the exam boards have issued guidance to us, I should point that out. But in the main, we've tried to use it creatively, and we've tried to say, look, it's here. We know youngsters are using it probably more creatively than we do. So what we might do, for example, I was in a class the other day in one of our schools, and they'd set an essay, and they'd deliberately set it up on ChatGPT, and the students were critiquing it and saying how it could be improved and so on. And I thought that was positive, because, we can go back to the days when calculators came in and all the rest of it. I'm a great believer in embracing new technologies and thinking about how we can make good use of them, rather than continually talking about banning and all the rest of it. Although, you know, we have to work within guidance clearly to make sure there's fairness in the system. But I thought that was a good example of maybe how it was being used creatively and imaginatively.
Absolutely. Next question is, you're in a huge organization. You're running a huge organization with 12 direct reports and a number of other reports, I guess, in finance and
Yeah.
all sorts of other things.
Yeah.
That's probably the maximum that you could handle. Where do you get support for Mike Foley?
Well, interesting enough, the my own coach was in today. She's just left, actually. I was explaining to her what I was doing. So I work with an amazing person who, from somebody, actually, again, it's interesting, does some work with education, but mainly not. Came from a banking background, actually, Derek. I was talking today about that. So she she set up a company, left the bank and set up a company called StudyFlex. And so she comes in and does my performance management, works with trustees and so on, and actually handles the, we bring her in to do performance management for the 12 heads as well.
Wow.
So they're doing, you know, and so they do the full thing, the 360, they do a disc review. And so, for example, one of the things I was doing just before I came on here, I keep a running log, you know, a reflective log in terms of my own leadership practice. I was feeding back to Rachel in terms of my own learning and what I was doing. And we included this as part of my learning, actually. So that's something that's really, really important. Those 12 heads, and indeed the main central staff here, the director of education, for example, they are our key. If they need to be working at the very, very top level. So we bring Rachel in with her company, and we have that continuous reflecting on performance. And we've moved away in schools. We got into a terribly bad habit where, you know, we said at one stage, less performance management, the once a year, get your targets out, and oh dear, what did I set myself last year? And moving more to managing performance, ongoing, continuous reflective journal. Go to your journal, which is online. I can read the reflective journals of all the heads and what's going on. I visit them once a half term to talk that through. So performance is massive for us. And back to that cogs, if we can make those cogs work really effectively, then that's going to have an impact on standards and outcomes.
Mike, I think industry could learn a lot from what you're doing there on those issues.
Oh, it's nice to hear, Derek. Yeah.
Almost Kaizen, isn't it? Continuous,
yes, it is.
Continuous learning,
It is
improvement.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we've only got time for one more question,
Yep.
but I'm interested in this particular question that Jill's put in the box. There's been a few experiments into limiting of use of mobile phones in schools. Clearly, there's a lot of mental health issues around some social media sites. What are you able to do about that?
Right. In short, I feel as though it's interesting, really, because when I went to Thomas Hardy, which was 2011, there was a thing about mobile phones, and they were completely banned at that time when I went in. And one of the staff there said to me that they had a snow day, and they had got all the students in the sports hall, and they said to the students, look, we know mobile phones are banned, but if you've got a mobile, if you happen to have, we're going to excuse you and go up the other end of the room and ring your parents and tell them that they need to come and pick you up. And rather than there being 2 or 3 students who went up the other end of the sports hall, there were only 2 or 3 left down this end who didn't have a phone. And so when I came in, and it was the time when mobile phones, smartphones were taking off, really. And I met with the student body, the student council, and I said, well, this is a bit of a nonsense, but I'm not having phones in school. So I'm going to compromise here, negotiate with you, Derek. And I'm going to say to you that I'm going to let us have mobile phones, but there's got to be conditions placed on them. And the condition was that the minute you enter the school gate, at whatever time it is, that phone gets completely turned off and put in your bag or away. And it doesn't get seen again until you leave the school gate at 4 o'clock, and then you turn it back on again. And the deal is that if at any time anyone sees a phone, breaks, lunch times, doesn't have to be, it gets confiscated. and the only people who can pick your phone up are your parents until they come in and get it from us. So we'll put it in a secure bag, we'll put it in the safe, and I don't want anybody to come to me if that's the conditions and argue with me when I take your phone off you and say that's the wrong thing to do, or I shouldn't take it and all the rest of it. And I have to say, until I left in 2021, that rule remained in place, Derek, and worked, I think incredibly well. Not to say that we didn't ever have people who decided they'd take a chance and sneak a phone out and all the rest of it. But I think in the main, it worked really, really well. And I would support all schools who would have that policy.
That sounds a fantastic negotiation, Mike. I think I might write about that in my newsletter.
Well, I did use it several times in assemblies, Derek, where I stood up and said, it was your colleagues and your peers who came up with the rule, because over the years, those students left. So I'd start the year off, and it was hugely powerful. I sat down, phones were banned. You agreed that was the rule. You agreed. I've kept my side of the bargain. You keep your side of the bargain. And it was a really powerful message. And in the main, of course, we had a few people taking a chance on it, but in the main, it worked incredibly effectively. I know some schools have done things where they've said, no, you can't have a phone, but, at break. But with us, it was absolutely not. If you're on the school field, and I had an eagle eye for spotting one, if I catch you on the school field with a phone, and I did say to the students at the time, if we start to get a pattern, where I'm picking up 10 mobile phones every lunchtime, we'll go back to square one and we'll renegotiate this. But it never got to that. We had the very odd occasion where we picked a phone up and all the rest of it. But for the most part, that rule held.
And Mike, how can you share this with other schools all around the country?
Yeah. Well, what we do is we do quite a lot of work. I do some speaking at, things like conferences, Derek. Obviously, through my work with Ofsted. And because in the main, we've been a successful trust, Derek, I often get asked to go and work with schools who are failing. It's quite an interesting, I'm a real, and for another podcast, I'm fascinated by failure, Derek. The science of failure, really why companies fail, why football clubs fail, why schools fail. And so we do an awful lot of work with schools who've maybe got into an Ofsted category or got into a problem for one way or another, in terms of, and we see that as part of our purpose is to support schools, and certainly supported by the members and the trustees. It's always been part of our philosophy that if we can help, why wouldn't we? So we do that kind of work with schools locally, and use some of the trainers here and so on, and use we've got a conference facility here. We invite those schools in and to come and use it.
Fantastic. Congratulations on everything you're doing. Now, we've almost come to the end, but I'm going to ask you this one last question.
Yeah.
There's one piece of advice to give people listening to this, watching this, even in 6 months' time, from the head of the Wessex Academy Trust. What would it be?
Piece of advice to anybody, I suppose, Derek, is to do with that thing of resilience. And I know that sounds, and developing resilience. And I think, if we had longer on the call, slightly worries me at the moment that post-COVID, where maybe, and it's not to say at all, do not think for 1 second that I underestimate problems in terms of mental ill health. I absolutely get it. But it sometimes worries me. I think resilience comes where you go through a tough time and you come through it, but you complete the cycle. And I often said to pupils that once you've gone through that hard time, please remember it, because the next time it happens, you've got that you've got that stored away. And so if there was one piece of advice I would give to people, my favorite phrase, Derek, is no matter what happens to you and how bad it is, you're to search for good out of bad. And that applies to anything in life, in your business, in your job. Search for it. It won't come easily if it's a really bad thing, but search for it. So in a breath, developing resilience by finding good from bad.
Fantastic, Mike. Mike Foley, thanks so much for joining Monday Night Live. And I'd ask members of Monday Night Live to give you the usual vote of thanks in the normal way.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who's come online to listen. Thank you, and giving up your time.
Well, thank you, and a huge congratulations to what you're doing there, the work you're doing with 7,000 students. And I hope you'll join us on Monday Night Live at another stage to talk about some other issues.
Yeah.
Mike, thanks very much.
Thank you, Derek.